Hello. I made a promise to myself that if I were to ever get into one of these bouts of consuming, I will record and create something in response to it. So, um, the first thing I want to talk about today is Yanis Varoufakis. He was the Greek minister during the 2008 financial crisis, and he's quite an interesting commentator on all things political, very much on the left of the political spectrum, but has some interesting thoughts that I want to, I guess, summarize in my own thoughts. I found a video of him speaking to Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell from The Rest is Politics, and he went through his background as somebody who is, I guess, he described as the petty bourgeois. His father was a Greek, but raised in Egypt, but trained in classical French political thought. I guess the first thing I thought is I never really understood how the world was like before I was born. Um, Specifically in context to what Varoufakis was saying about the Greek expat community in Egypt. He described it as basically, the first class. The Egyptian people were servants to this colonial group, and you had people from France, from England, from Spain, from maybe not from Spain, I don't actually know. Point being is that they were white people but European, and they were the colonial overlords of Egypt. I guess it felt in that moment very surprising to me how near, how close the colonial period is, insofar as there's somebody who is alive today and I'm speaking to who's only one generation away from a group of people who are still living off the benefits of colonialism in Egypt. And I guess you could even argue that, yeah, that's still the case even now. But it just feels almost like it was a bit jarring. There's a movie called Death in the River Nile, and that's a movie. When you watch it, you just think, oh, this is like a long, long time ago, but not really. If I was born 100 years ago, I would be experiencing that world right now. And I guess it's such a stark contrast from SpaceX and AI and from the Iran war. Sometimes it feels like it's so far away that it's irrelevant. But that's obviously not true. The other thing they spoke about is game theory. So game theory is quite a common subject in my bubble of consumption. It's probably been brought to my attention more now because of Professor Zhang, as he's called on YouTube, and he supposedly uses game theory to. It's kind of cold, isn't it? He kind of uses game theory to predict how the world is gonna play out. And the interview with Yanis Varoufakis, he made it very clear that you should not use game theory at all. The reason being is because he described it as using a chess player in a war zone. That kind of makes sense. Game theory, as far as I know, is basically modeling the world through maths, through rational thought, through a game. To say if one person does this, the only rational thought is that the other person will do this, and there is probably a list of options that they can take, and one is, I guess, rationally more correct than the other. I never thought about it like a chess player in a war zone. I don't know if, based off what I heard from the interview with Varoufakis, whether game theory does actually make sense then. In that context, of course, it doesn't make sense. The world is infinitely more complex than any theory or formula that somebody could come up with about how the world should work and how characters should be behaving in that world. I think it's a pretty compelling case against game theory. 2008 financial crisis. So the 2008 financial crisis was, I was alive during the financial crisis. I had no idea what was going on at the time, and it does blow my mind how so much of it is connected to the 2008 financial crisis, how much of our current world is connected to it. And the example of Greece, it just kind of made things feel really alive for me, in that I, you understand how banks work in a very rudimentary sense. They have money, they want to loan it to someone so that they can make money on the interest. Makes sense. Businesses, people like borrowing money because then you can own an asset that you wouldn't ordinarily own, and you just pay off the loan. I guess in that point of view, it's a win-win. Somebody doesn't have money, somebody has money, they exchange it, both parties come out of it winning. But the 2008 financial crisis and the impact it had on the Greece economy was kind of like a very, I don't want to use the word easy, but a very clear example of how systems work, broadly speaking. So the example that Varoufakis used with the credit card, being using credit cards to pay off a mortgage, um, I never thought about it like that. And I guess supposedly that's what happened in the 2008 financial crisis in a nation with nation states. A lot of people had debt that they could not repay, bank loans that were basically given um, to countries, and obviously those loans are supposed to be paid back, but probably at a lower interest. And when you can't pay them back, you're given a bailout at a much higher interest. And all you're really doing with that bank loan is all you're really doing with that bailout is paying off the original bank loan that you can't pay off anymore. But because of the interest, it's so much higher than what you would have previously known. I Part of me thinks, how does that contrast with modern monetary theory, where the argument is to just basically print more money, and when there is a deficit in um, when there is a surplus in the economy, the modern monetary theory suggests that that's actually money being extracted out of the economy, versus when there is a deficit, that means that you're putting money into the economy. I don't understand it in any way, in any meaningful way. But I do think it's interesting to have heard someone describe the 2008 financial crisis and how it impacted Greece in such simple terms. I think he was really good at describing a very complex subject. Techno feudalism. I think he said it was in the 1700s where we had moved away from feudalism to capitalism. So, feudalism being somebody owns a piece of land and the people who work on that land have to pay rent so that they can work the land and make a living for themselves. I guess they would be the plebs or the peasants, and the feudal lords would be the people who own the land. And the shift happened during the Industrial Revolution, where we moved from land as sort of capital towards means of production, so machines that can build things. So it doesn't really matter what you build, the fact that you have the capacity to build it is what the world is going to be built around. That's what made capitalism so unique in that respect. You have a capitalist, somebody who owns a factory, a manufacturing site, or whatever it might be, and they can build basically anything. And if you have ownership over that machine, you will be the overlords of the new system. The idea of techno feudalism is that we've seen another evolution of that, which is not whether you have the means of production, but do you have, he describes the cloud capital. So Amazon would be a good example of somebody or of something that has cloud capital. It controls, I guess, the physical or the digital space with which the digital world runs, kind of similar to feudal lords, where people have to pay rent to the feudal lords to earn an income. the same is true for people in the cloud world. If you have ownership over the cloud, the people who are using that cloud have to pay you rent in order to use it. Kind of makes you think you should have big, broad ambitions. I find it so fascinating that, yeah, I find it so fascinating. I don't know how else to describe it. I think, as I'm speaking to you now, maybe you also feel it, but when you're consuming content, you just feel so intelligent. You feel like you know what you're talking about. Oh, you make these points, and you think, oh, that's good, that's bad. You're right, you're wrong, or whatever it might be. But when you have to actually speak out your thoughts and try and recollect your points in a cohesive manner, it becomes really difficult. And I realized just how little I know. I guess the other question is, how much do I really need to know? Sometimes I think to myself, I'm here to just build a business, build financial wealth for my family, build financial independence, have fuck you money. And I think to myself, like, wow, I just I'm just a small cog in this system. So much of it is outside of my control. Yeah. On to the next video.